how do we adapt? You don't want to throw out, you don't want to start anew. This is not that time. And Mike Petrilli, who's the president of the Thomas B. Fordham Institute, I'm going through your bio now, Mike, so you know who you are, research fellow at Stanford University's Hoover Institute and executive director of Education Next. He's also an award-winning writer and author of The Diverse Schools Dilemma, editor of Education for Upward Mobility. He has published opinion pieces in the New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, Bloomberg View, and Slate, and frequently appears on radio and television. He's helped to create the U.S. Department of Education's Office of Innovation and Improvement, the Policy Innovators in Education Network, and Young Education Professionals. He currently serves on the advisory board of the Association of American Educators, MDRC, and the Texas Institute of Education Reform. And I have had the pleasure of knowing Mike for many years and found his insights and breadth of knowledge to be rewarding and challenging to us. As a Thomas B. Fordham is a critic and a insightful one at times, but one who certainly challenges. And Mike and I have frequently talked about how much we learn from the interactions of all of this. And not interestingly enough, but one of the points of contact and agreement is about the importance of high level college and career ready standards. So today we'll be talking with him on where we are on implementation. And the way we're going to work this is that there is a section called live chat on your board here. And please feel free at any time to put questions. Mike and I have a set of questions, some of which we'll expand on as the answers go forward. And we'll talk for about 30 minutes and then more formally open it up for questions. But please feel free to put a question in at any time. Mike, thank you for joining us today. And first and foremost, as the school year comes to a close, what do you think are the key trends in the field, especially with regards to college and career ready standards?
Right. Okay. Well, first of all, thank you, Rich, so much for bringing me on and giving me this opportunity. I'm sorry I was a little late getting on with our technical difficulties. So a couple of thoughts. First of all, like you said in the opening, there is some good news right now, which is that it does feel like the worst of the Common Core wars, if we want to call it that, are behind us. That's not to say that there won't be more states where there are debates over whether they should stick with these standards. There will certainly be some. But I think anybody would tell you on any side of this issue that the number of bills that have been introduced, the intensity of the fight, all of that is way down from 2014 and certainly 2015. And this spring, it just seemed a whole lot quieter than had been in the years past. I think there is a sense that these standards now are entrenched and that they are here to stay, at least in 40 states or so. There are a handful of states, Oklahoma most certainly, but you could argue South Carolina, Indiana, that have made pretty major changes to the standards, and certainly their policymakers claim that they've moved beyond the Common Core. Other states like Tennessee, Louisiana, and beyond have gone through some kind of review process, but most folks who have looked at the standards there say, well, they look pretty similar to the old ones. So, states might call them something different. They may have made some changes, but by and large, these college and career ready standards are still in place. Now, of course, you know that we are strong supporters of these standards, and that's because we think they're very good. That back in 2010, when they came out, we had experts that we trust look at them carefully and evaluate them and compare them to what the states had in place before. And we found them to be dramatically better than what most states had, that they were clear, that they were rigorous, and that they did a faithful job representing what we know from science and evidence and practice about what it takes to get kids ready for college and career and where they need to be along the way. Doesn't mean they're perfect. And by all means, everybody is going to need to go through a process eventually to look at the standards and to revise them based on new things that we learn, including what we learned from implementation. So, but the good news is, I think I think most of the political craziness is behind us. I think the new federal law helps in that it makes it quite clear that the states now own this issue again. It's up to them what standards they want to use. That takes the federalism issue off the table. And so now we move forward. And here we are, I would argue, really only about a year, maybe a little more than a year, into full implementation, meaning that it was only a little more than a year ago that most states used assessments linked to these standards for the first time. It was only this fall that schools and educators and parents got test scores back related to these new standards. And now we just went through the second round of testing. So we are still very early in having all of the pieces together. We are still seeing textbook publishers still just now coming out with truly aligned Common Core textbooks. So it is still early days. And I hope that we stick with this reform over the long term better than we have past reforms. We have this terrible habit in education of chasing the latest shiny object rather than seeing things through. And this is something that's going to need many more years of seeing through until we are ready to know whether it can fulfill its potential. Meaning, look, let's get past the political debate. Let's talk about how we can improve practice in America's classrooms. And I know a lot of educators are out there doing exactly that.
One of the things we've been discussing about at the national level for well over 60 years is this idea of, that the role of the federal government is to provide resources to help close the achievement gap between the three special groups, economically disadvantaged kids, disabled, and language minority. And there are a lot of issues here on the table with the Common Core standards, college and career ready standards. How does all of this, do you think, interact together? This idea of closing the achievement gap as something, an avowed goal of all of us, and this as a tool.
Yeah, and I'm just turning off the volume a bit so I don't get an echo. Yeah, look, I think for one thing, there's no doubt that these standards, because they are so challenging, because the new tests are so much more rigorous than the past ones, that what they show, at least when you first look at it, is a widening achievement gap. That's because, look, the easiest way to close an achievement gap is just to have very low standards. If you have low enough standards, everybody meets them, and there's no gap. You have high standards, and then groups that are traditionally disadvantaged are going, at least at first, going to be further from that bar, and that's what we've seen today. Look, we know from research, including a new study that we just came out with at the Thomas B. Fordham Institute last week that looked at Common Core math. We know that teachers are telling us that their biggest struggle is with kids who are far behind, that these are tough standards, and it is hard, especially if you're talking about middle school, high school, and you may have students who are 3-4 years behind. It is not clear how to help them catch up to these high standards. And there certainly needs to be more materials and more help and guidance and support to do exactly that. But the goal here is to align our classroom expectations with the hopes and dreams and expectations of America's kids across all these racial and class groups. Every survey that we do, parents of all racial groups, parents of all class groups, and the kids themselves, everybody aspires to go to college, at least some kind of college. If not a 4-year degree, then some kind of technical college. And lo and behold, we're at the point now, Rich, where going to college is practically universal. 70% of high school graduates go immediately to college, and a big chunk of the rest will give it a try within 2 or 3 or 4 years of graduating from high school. The problem is we only have something like 40% of high school graduates who are actually graduating ready for college. And we see what happens. We see that we have this huge number of young people who then go to college, mostly community colleges, sometimes 4 years, end up in remedial education and almost never get out. And so now they're 19, they're 20, they're a college dropout. They often have picked up student debt, and they've got nothing. They've got no credential. They've got no work training. They don't have the skills they need to succeed in this economy. Terrible way to begin. So, what we're trying to do here is to say, look, if people are aspiring to college and to good paying careers, let's not give them a false sense along the way in our K-12 system that they're doing fine when they're not doing fine. That was the problem with the old system.
Mike, I want to bore into this idea of, kids graduating college and career ready. I mean, all the manufacturers are telling us about the literally hundreds of thousands of jobs ready to go today and millions more that could be available if the kids had the reading, writing, problem solving, mathematics skills to function at a high level. Our teachers, our principals, our superintendents, and school board people in LFA are saying, look, we have to make changes in what we're doing in order to get this right. That the standards are the right way to go, but it's the implementation that we really need to sink our teeth in. How are we going to get to doing it in the way where we're going to be graduating kids who can, I just think personally, last year I had to put a new roof on my house, and the guy whose bid I took was the guy who went to community college who learned how to write a proposal. Mm-hmm. We're not talking about great literature here,
right?
But how do we get it so that, he didn't learn that he needed to do that in high school, which is, that's not good. But he did have the knowledge to go to community college to get the skill. How do we get more kids learning how to write those proposals so that I have 5 really good proposals to choose from?
Right. No, great question. Look, I'm new to the career and technical education world. Like many people in the education reform movement, I had long been skeptical of it, thinking of it as in the old days of VOTech, when the system tracked kids into dead-end tracks, especially poor and minority kids. What I didn't realize, and now what I guess I've become an evangelical for, is that CTE has changed dramatically, at least in lots of places, where it is now much higher quality than it used to be. And it is preparing young people for post-secondary education. Just instead of 4-year degrees in philosophy, it's technical degrees, but degrees that are great on entryways into middle-class jobs and beyond, like the one that you just described. Now, when you dig into that and you say, okay, how are we going to get more people prepared for those jobs that do exist? First of all, you learn that it's got to start in high school. That this notion we're just going to give everybody exactly the same kind of education through 18 years old, and then they can decide. It's just too late. No other country in the world does that. Everybody understands that at some point in high school, by say age 15, you've got to start allowing kids to go a technical pathway if that's what they want to do. But it's got to be high quality. It's got to be rigorous, and the standards have got to be high. And guess what? If you're going to succeed in those technical pathways, you can't be 2 or 3 grade levels behind in reading and math. It doesn't make our job any easier in K-8. In fact, what this has convinced me of is that we've got to have a greater sense of urgency than ever. That if a kid's going to have any shot, either of taking a traditional college prep route that's going to lead to advanced placement and that's going to lead to credit-bearing courses, or if they're going to take a rigorous career and technical education route that's going to lead to these kinds of opportunities, by 8th grade, they have got to be ready. They've got to be doing math and reading and writing at very high levels. And so that, if anything, just puts greater pressure on us. And then, look, and I do think the standards indicate ways that we've got to get it done. But, we know from our studies and others that there's still some very big gaps. I'm happy to drill down into those if you want to.
Yeah, well, I did a study with NICHD a couple of years ago on the reading and writing connection, and we found that a high number of teachers, mostly because of NCLB, hadn't been teaching writing or hadn't been taught writing. Right. And that was just narrative writing. And as many people aren't aware, it isn't just narrative writing that the college and career standards are talking about. It's argumentative writing. Mm-hmm. How are we going to retool those teachers? Because, we can't, these are people who know how to teach, are willing to do it, and it's up to the society to get them the tools. How are we going to do that? Yeah,
no, it's a great point. I mean, the first thing is that we have to make sure that we're sending the signals that writing matters again. And that's why these new assessments are so important. We did a big evaluation earlier this year of PARCC and Smarter Balanced and ACT Aspire and the old MCAS exam. And look, what you find is that PARCC and Smarter Balanced, though they've gotten beaten up some politically, they do a very good job testing the standards. They're very well aligned. And one way they do that is there's a whole lot of writing on those exams. Less so for ACT Aspire, certainly less so for most of the old standardized tests that we've been having. I mean, they just didn't have any, didn't have any writing on them. Other exams that people use, like NWEA's MAP assessment, that still doesn't have any writing. So, this is hugely important that, first of all, states have got to make sure that if they want teachers to teach writing, that they got to test writing. And it's crazy to think that we could get kids college ready and not teach them to write. So that's one thing. And I do think those writing prompts on Smarter Balance, on Park are quite good. Those tests deserve a lot of credit for moving forward, and the kind of writing that we would want our kids to be able to do. So that's first. But then, as you say, look, we have got to invest in curriculum, in materials, in opportunities for professional learning around writing that has not happened in years, if not decades. And I think that's hugely important. Look, another area on English language arts that we're very concerned about is that the standards make it very clear that the way we're going to help all kids learn to read at high levels is not only by doing a better job with the early decoding and scientifically based instruction piece, but also building content knowledge. And the sooner the better. That the reason so many kids aren't learning to read is because they don't have the vocabulary. They don't have the content knowledge. They can sound out Tyrannosaurus Rex, but they don't know anything about dinosaurs. They're not going to be able to read a narrative about it. So that means, for example, bringing back science and history and geography and art and music starting in kindergarten. But that message does not seem to be getting through either, at least in the system as a whole. But look, I think that's the sort of thing that we've got to keep working on, is to say, hey, how, these higher standards do not require a tweak to the way we do teaching and learning in this country. They require a transformation. And I worry that, in part because of the political debate, there's been a lot of messages about how, we don't need to change our praxis too much. We just got to, no, we've got to change dramatically. Again, if we want to get beyond 40% of our young people actually being ready, and we want to get that number much, much higher, we need very dramatic changes.
Well, do you think that the political structure right now could take the truth of saying, look, these are big changes. We're quite excited about this, but we're going to need 10 years of investment because the standards have been rolled out in a shotgun start. So if you're in 8th grade, you started the standards in the 8th grade. But next year, that 8th grade teacher is now going to have a kid who's had 1 year of standards-based instruction, and in the following year, 2, 3. So the curriculum always is going to need to be made better, and the professional development is going to need better. But we have, in a sense, we have a problem on implementation, and that is the body politic has been fighting about, should there be standards like they are or not? And, and as we established at the top, that's done. Now it's implementation.
It's done. Again, but look, I think we won. I mean, the standards are still there. They're still standing. That's good news. But yes, it's taken its toll. And I guess the question now is whether we can protect educators from any more political nonsense so they can do the work at hand. And I'm somewhat optimistic. I mean, there's surely those of us that are policy wonks and are concerned with the policy stuff. We're all on to the implementation of ESSA, and people are talking about this or that, the other thing. Hey, here's the good news. I don't think that stuff's going to have a huge impact on the day-to-day life of most schools. All right. And so I do think there's an opportunity here for superintendents and chief academic officers and principals and teachers to kind of put their heads down from all that stuff and focus on, hey, how can we work together here in our community to implement these standards? What can we learn from other schools and districts like our own? Where can we look for best practices? And there are some examples. There are some states that have really done a good job leading and providing opportunities. Louisiana comes to mind. Very red state in the middle of all kinds of political challenges. Their state superintendent, John White, has provided great professional learning opportunities to teachers across the state around these standards, a lot of teacher-to-teacher learning. If Louisiana can do it, so can anybody else. But it is going to take leadership.
Right, and I think part of the question also implies what you said. Those of us who are policy wonks, Washington-based, how do we change the discussion so we get onto the real lift at hand here? And I think you're right. Part of it is talking about what's working, and part of it's keeping a focus on what the need is now.
Yeah, and look, I think, I mean, the best thing we can do is to not rush to the next one. Is just to keep steady for a while. And I think, look, I think there's a possibility that could happen. I think in many states you're also seeing, as we've come out of this very long recovery, that the funding picture is better than it's been in many years. Doesn't mean it's great, but it's better. And that, schools might be seeing more resources that can be targeted towards professional learning. I guess the main message is this: if you think that you are done implementing the Common Core, I would really challenge that. Because, I mean, unless you're a total outlier, we're just not seeing it in the national data. We're not, unless you've transformed your elementary school curriculum to be much more content-based, unless you've, dramatically changed the way that you're doing math so that there's both the strong focus on arithmetic in the early grades as well as the conceptual understanding, unless you've totally revamped your approach to writing, unless you're getting, 80-90% of your kids to a college and career ready level, look, you got a lot of work to do. And so, we got to push back when we hear some leaders say, oh yeah, we did that years ago. Nah, I don't know. A lot of work still to be done.
A lot of work. It's a slightly different question, but back into the politics a little bit. I have a brother, and he and his wife have 3 really capable kids up in New York State. And they got, an earful on the opt-out movement.
Yeah.
What's your take on that? Is that a slow burning fire? Is it petering out? Have we turned the corner, or is it going to get worse?
Look, I first of all, I think it's important to say it's not a coincidence that you mentioned New York. I think it is mostly a New York phenomenon. Mm-hmm. That it really burst onto the scene in 2015, and it was huge. I mean, look, we're talking about a quarter of the kids in New York opting out. And I think a lot of us were concerned that it would spread to other states in 2016, and it just didn't. I mean, there's a few pockets, the Pacific Northwest, there's some pockets, Colorado had some pockets. I mean, you see a few pockets. It tends to be the more affluent areas. It tends to be for high school, especially. And you can understand, 11th graders are already taking the ACT and the SAT and APs, and, to take one more test that they don't see as valuable. But it really does seem confined to New York. And, I think New York has shown us time and again what not to do. Don't rush the implementation of the standards. Don't rush a new test. Don't tie teacher evaluations to test scores, on and on and on. And here we are. But look, I am hopeful that across the country it will peter out. But we need to be aware that it could continue in other places, and we've got to keep working on addressing the legitimate concerns of over-testing, of bad tests, of how these tests are used. I think in most states now, if you're using PARCC or Smarter Balanced, the tests are dramatically better than they used to be. But that may mean that it's time to let go of some of those other tests we've been using at the local level.
And that's something, too, that was also addressed during the reauthorization that became the Every Student Succeeds Act. Chairman Alexander started talking about over-testing, and then he qualified that to said, yes, the federal government does X, but states and locals do several times that. But in terms of parents and the Common Core and these issues, I know you have young children, don't you?
I do indeed.
Yeah. Have you had the opportunity yet to sit down and try to teach a mathematics concept that you do not know?
That's a good question. I've got a rising third grader, and I've seen the number lines. That's certainly something, and I've seen a few problems at home that give me make me scratch my head. So yeah, I've seen a little bit of it. Not too much yet. I think it's going to be another year or two till I see a lot of that. we have this brand new study out on Common Core math, where people should check it out at excellence.net. And one of the main findings is that though teachers like the Common Core standards, they buy in, they think that they're going to help, they are hearing tons of complaints from kids and from parents who are frustrated, especially with the requirement to use multiple methods to get the same answer, to describe how you got to the answer. And and we really try to puzzle this out about why is this causing so much consternation. And one strategy could be, look, the standards do require still the arithmetic. They require kids to know their times tables and their math facts. There's sometimes a perception that stuff is gone. It is not gone. In fact, it's actually stronger in the Common Core than in most state standards. That's one of the reasons we at Fordham like these standards. So you know what? Teachers might want to just have kids practice that stuff at home. Have kids practice their times tables and their math facts. Get those old flashcards out. That is still very important and useful. And then they can do some of the other stuff that's newer and maybe harder and more confusing in school. I think that is certainly one strategy.
And two, what you're talking about is that these are issues we have to identify as professional educators and not discount. I remember one of the families I worked with, the parent wanted to be both the cheerleader and the teacher.
Yep.
And it was like, no, you want to work as a team with your teacher so you can be the cheerleader as much as possible.
Yeah. And look, I think the message goes something like this on the math. It says, look, it is absolutely important that kids know the right answer. And the standards still make it clear. You need to know that 8 times 4 is 32. You just do. And you need to know that, to automaticity. We know from research that if kids can do that clears up brain space to do the harder stuff. But, if you're going to get ready for algebra later on, you have to start understanding why it is that 8 times 4 equals 32. And that's what we're trying to get to. And so it's both. And what we haven't done well in the past, and why a lot of kids end up not doing well in advanced math, is that maybe they memorize the math facts, but they don't understand, what's going on with those numbers. So there it is, and it just, so you meet the parents where they are. You're like, absolutely, I want your kids to be able to get the right answer. Once they do that, though, we want to go even higher, which is actually even harder to figure out 3 ways to get that answer and to explain why it works and to understand that, this is actually, in effect, algebra, in action.
Right.
And by the way, I say all of this as completely not a math guy, so I probably butchered that. My apologies.
Well, you're also giving good guidance as a parent, as to what you want to be hearing from your parent, your kids' teachers,
yep.
Their administrators. You want to be explained what's going on, so you don't feel like you're not engaged.
No, absolutely. And look, I'll be honest with Rich. I am worried that you see these stories or you hear these anecdotes that teachers are saying, kids don't need to know their times tables anymore. They don't need to know their math facts. They don't need to memorize these things. It's all this conceptual understanding. And I think, oh my God, they don't. It's very clear. Go look at the standards in kindergarten, 1st, 2nd, 3rd grade. The arithmetic is in there. They do need to know that stuff. It's just not all they need to know. And maybe because in some states, the conceptual understanding and the multiple methods, that's what's new and that's what's sexy. That's what's getting all the attention. But parents are right to be concerned if they hear their teacher say, your kid doesn't need to know their times tables anymore. Then that's just not true.
Well, I think we're also getting around to back around to this, the professional learning activities. Teachers need real time to unpack these standards. A friend of mine, Barbara Kapanis, used to work over at the National Education Association on the standards, and she's a PhD. And has worked as a teacher, worked as a leader. And one of the things she told me is that she lives with the standards, and every day she reads a new nuance into this.
Yeah.
And again, this is getting back to this idea that these are not absolute. They're guidelines to developing curriculum, and we have to be explaining all these and listening to each other in order to make a difference.
No, that's right. And by the way, it's crazy to have 3 million teachers out there trying to do that by themselves.
Right.
One reason why curriculum is so important is that it's an opportunity for teachers and publishers to come together, study the standards, look at research, and develop something really good that none of them could develop on their own, and then you kind of throw the standards out the window and focus on teaching that curriculum really well.
Right.
And yet, again, in many of our debates, we downplay the importance of curriculum. Now, it should be a national curriculum. There should be lots of options, but it's really important that school districts adopt a great curriculum and adopt great materials. And, again, that piece is still early days, early going. I mean, but the exciting thing is we are starting to see some very good materials. And the group edreports.org, which might be a fantastic one to have on one of your webcasts, is doing a great job reviewing textbooks and other curriculum resources. A lot of the open education resources like Engage New York that are out there and are quite good. And suddenly, wow, materials developed by teachers, for teachers, high quality and free and available nationwide. This is new. This is a big deal. But again, it's the very beginnings of taking advantage of this.
I'm going to, as we're coming close to the end of this phase of our discussion, if we were doing this a year from now, what do you think would be our topics of conversation?
Well, as we discussed earlier, I hope it's the same ones, right? I hope we're not chasing the next shiny object. Look, I think that the policy world is going to continue to be obsessed with the new federal law. Won't be so new then. But by a year from now, states will be submitting their plans with their new accountability systems and saying how they're going to grade schools and what they're going to do for low-performing schools. If there's anybody home at the U.S. Department of Education after this election, then the department will be reviewing and perhaps approving these things. That's a big if a certain businessman ends up winning in the fall. His team's going to take a long time to get put in place. But I think the issues are going to be the same for most educators, which is how do we get better and better at teaching these standards? Let me put one other thing out there too, Rich. Some of us have been puzzling over this question. Says, why is it we've moved to these higher standards, these much tougher tests, and we've now had at least one time where we've told parents, the vast majority of parents in the country, your child is not on track. And yet we don't seem to be hearing much about that. And we don't hear a lot of parents saying, oh, my God, I had no idea. What am I going to do about this? What some of us are starting to wonder is, look, if you get a test score back once a year that says your kid's not on track, but you get reports from teachers, you get grades, you get all kinds of progress reports weekly saying that your kid's doing great, which are you going to believe? And it could be that we really need to have a serious discussion about the messages we are sending to parents. What are we telling kids and parents with grades and report cards and parent-teacher conferences and all the rest? Are we sending a message to them that their kid's doing fine, even if they are not meeting these standards? And do we need to think about that and maybe start being willing to be more honest, to say, Johnny's working hard and he's really trying, but I got to say he's not where he needs to be if he wants to be on track for college.
So that would be one of the issues we want to flag for ourselves into this year. Is there a disjointer between the informal messaging and the formal messaging?
And even the formal, right? I mean, if a kid's, Rich, it makes me wonder how many kids out there have gone through the school system, gotten A's and B's, and then ended up in remedial education. Now, you make an argument that, there's always going to be some kids who, maybe they don't test well or there's issues, but, on the whole, you shouldn't be able to get, A's if you're not on track for college and career and you're not graduating from high school college ready. And yet I do worry that there's lots and lots of schools where that happens. And we're thinking at Fordham about maybe trying to expose that, but also just, start that conversation that says, look, what you might be giving that A because you want to reward effort or you want to indicate, you're proud of the student. That's fine. But keep in mind that you might be actually doing some harm there if you're sending a message to them and their parents that they're doing fine when they're not.
It's an interesting issue that you raised, because I was a teacher for a graduate course on ed policy. And, these are adults. And when we got to the evaluation, it was tough for some people not to get an A.
Yeah.
I think that this is, kind of one of those discussions that we need to not be pointing blame, but as much as taking responsibility in how we have this discussion, because it's it hits a lot of people pretty close to home if they don't know it's coming. If you know it's coming, if you know where the strike zone is,
Yep.
There's a perception of fairness. If the strike zone is changing with every pitch,
right,
you claim it's unfair, and that's where we get into problems.
No, I agree. And look, I think that's why the biggest mistake of this whole thing was the teacher evaluation reforms. I just think were just huge problem. Whether there's an argument that says, look, we need to do a better job evaluating teachers and differentiating, and that's important. But the message it sent at exactly the wrong time was that we're out to get you, and in a way that teachers didn't trust. And I just think that poisoned the well. I wish we could have that back.
I think that, there's also another issue that I think we have to be aware of in terms of teacher evaluation. And our data, by the way, is reporting the same thing. There was several of these major issues hit all at once. And so the quote, the standards stood for all of these problems, which really hurt the political discussion. But I think we also have to be honest, in the education community about things like evaluations. This is an open question in almost every business. Mm-hmm. How do we evaluate, soldiers? How do we evaluate businessmen? And we're in a business here where the agreement about how learning actually occurs isn't there yet. And so we don't even have a strike zone.
Right. And it's not fundamentally about the evaluation. It could be. If the conversation was, hey, how do we provide better feedback to teachers about their practice, would have been a very different conversation. In some states, the leaders were able to keep it focused on that, and it went much better. If part of the issue is, look, we feel like we've had low standards for entry into the teaching profession, at least in the past, and we need to have some mechanism for getting teachers, including tenured teachers, removed from the classroom if they're not performing well. Then this becomes part of the conversation. The thing was, just changing the way we evaluate teachers isn't nearly enough. You have to reform tenure. You have to change contracts. You have to go all the way on creating a system where it's possible, in a fair way, but possible, to remove ineffective teachers from the classroom. And I think we were naive. And look, I think that Arnie Duncan and his team was naive to think that they could do that from Washington with some new federal mandate. And we've paid the price. Right.
No, I agree. It was a poorly thought out set of ideas. And the other reality is it's made it that much harder to recruit people who want to become teachers. And then, of course, it also has polluted the conversation about, we are expecting so much out of a 4-year education for teachers. There are people who say, well, teachers don't know how to teach reading for high need kids. So they should be taught that. I was at a program a few weeks ago and it was talking about social emotional learning. Teachers don't know about social emotional learning. If you add up all the things society is saying, 4 years, it can't hold. We have a much bigger discussion to have there. And and the evaluation part is it's part of it, but we have to be talking about solutions. So, I'm wondering if we have some questions here. Let's see. Not seeing.
It's like there was a question about, a state that's done a good job with standards implementation. I guess we talked about that a little bit, that I'd look at Louisiana as having done a particularly good job. What was so brilliant is that in some ways it flew below the political radar screen. It was all about, just information to teachers and opportunities for teachers to come have professional learning run by other teachers. And I think we're going to see, I'm hopeful, fingers crossed, but we're going to see a big impact in Louisiana on student achievement over time, and just teachers feeling very good about they're understanding the standards because they've had an opportunity to come together multiple times and dig into the stuff in a way that very few other states have provided.
One of the things our data is showing us is that the members of the various professions, principals, teachers, superintendents, they very much depend on their own societies for information about how to do this. But yet at the same time, they're very hungry to make sure that all of us who are talking about these things have the same goals in mind and putting the same things on the table.
Yeah. So, yeah. And I see a question about the upcoming election. I guess maybe you tackled that too, but.
Well, it's, the upcoming election, which isn't really the subject of this, but we do know that in many state elections that the education has been one of the top draw issues at state and local level now for well over 15 years. And, that is where these real decisions are being made about what's in the curriculum, what is in the professional development, what is in the professional learning. And that's something that we really do have to have vibrant conversations about.
Yep, that's right.
So, we're coming up, let's see, if you would think about maybe anything you want to say in closing and see if any other questions come up as you give that some thought. I do want to thank you for taking the time. Your perspective is certainly insightful. And as you've pointed out in many of your answers, the answer to these issues is not one part. There is a web here, a tapestry that needs to be understood before you pull on any one string. And it takes time, it takes patience, and frankly, it's going to take leadership across the board. And you've been demonstrating this on this and other issues for many, many years.
Oh, thanks, Rich. Thank you. Oh, I guess just in closing, I think those of us in the policy world have got to do our job, which is to try to protect educators from more wrenching changes and allow them to see this one through. Let's see this reform through. We think about some other reforms that we've had over the years, like small schools movement, was big, a lot of foundation money behind it. And then all of a sudden, early signs didn't look good and we just washed it away. Well, some long-term studies have come out that at least in a few cities like New York, those smaller high schools did a whole lot of good. And too bad we didn't stick with it. So here we are, early days. Let's keep looking for exemplars. Let's keep looking for states and districts that are doing particularly well and emulate them. And then let's stick with it and give teachers an opportunity to get better and better at teaching to these standards. Look, I think that, the real, to me, what we got to see over time is if we can get that number, the 40% of kids that are graduating college and career ready, can we dramatically increase that number? And if we can, it's going to mean a whole lot for the future of this country and many of the challenges that we've got.
Our future has certainly been spoken about by Thomas Jefferson many times, and he wrote to a colonel in 1815, "A nation that expects to be ignorant and free expects what never was and what will never be."
Right.
And this is our challenge now to stay the course, to adapt, but not to adapt blindly. So, right. Michael, thank you very much for your time. This is Richard Long with the Learning First Alliance. Thanking all of you for joining us. We will have this on the Learning First website, and you're free to download and share with your colleagues. For Michael Petrilli, this is Rich Long saying thank you.
Thanks, Rich.